The Great War is over and peace has been signed, and the Central Powers celebrate their victory across the width and breadth of their nations. Marches and parades and other demonstrations of happiness occur across every major city and town in the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. In the Entente Cordiale cities and towns, the mood is much more somber. It's an atmosphere of relief at the conclusion of this war, but also a sense of pride at how well their troops have fought, with gallantry, with bravery, with heroism, and deserving of respect and honor. Every nation within this conflict has conducted themselves well and upheld their national honor, a job well done for all parties involved. Welcome all to Operation Schlieffen. My name is Jinx, and this is a conclusion and wrap-up video for this operation. I want to say that Davvyk and Elite Golden have conducted themselves well. They have played a great game. They have been strategic. They've shown strategic brilliance and surprised me a good few times at some of the movements and campaigns that they've launched, and they've done a fantastic job of it. They've been great opponents to be against. They've always been of a cheery spirit, despite how grim things may have looked for them, or despite how well things look for them. They always maintained a gallant and friendly spirit, which I really do appreciate. And really, they've had me. I've really enjoyed playing with these guys, and I wouldn't hesitate to play with them once again in the future. Well done, guys. It's been a pleasure, and yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure. And thanks for playing with me. I really do appreciate it. And despite you guys being in a tough position here towards the end, I really respect that you guys just pulled through and just still stuck with it and had fun with it. Thanks, guys. So this video is a bit of a debrief and a review of the game, the Operation Schlieffen. And I had the advantage of looking back at history, looking back at, through 2020 hindsight, at how things went and what could have been done differently and what people could have done and what I could have done and what I could have spent my money on. But I have the advantage and the wisdom of hindsight. Whereas if you looked at my videos from back in the day, I was probably quite worried about the state of affairs. I thought for sure things would collapse on the Central Powers and we'd find ourselves in a difficult position quite quickly. So let me see if I could come up with some sort of after-action report on how we conducted ourselves. And again, I want to say, though, that I have no criticism or I don't look down at my opponents in any way, shape, or form. They've done a fantastic job of it, and I have the greatest of respect for them. So let's take a look at the situation here. Let's start off with the Austro-Hungarian turn. And if my memory serves, some of the occurrences that happened quite quickly there. We set out with this idea of always mathematically calculating every single battle. And I mean, we would lay out the dice and say, okay, for every 3 infantry, we could expect 1 hit. Mathematically looking at every single battle and trying to calculate it to the point where if the dice worked to their average, we'd always do a clean sweep of the opponent's units, if at all possible, or at least we can contest them and match them. I've also approached this game with a spirit of the goal is not necessarily capturing a territory in most, in some circumstances, and some there are exceptions, of course. You want positional battles to be won. But the goal is to cause more damage to the enemy than they cause to us, something along those lines. So our first move as the Austrians was Serbia. We had to attack Serbia. My thinking was attack Serbia with sufficient strength to capture that territory. Next thought was, okay, Romania. Attack Romania with sufficient strength to capture that territory. And I had sufficient troops to do so. And I sent them into that fight with that intention. And then Venice, the idea was, well, let's at least contest that territory, because if we don't, then the Italians can hit us either in Tyrolia or Trieste. And so we wanted to prevent that from occurring. And so we did. We were lucky, actually, in all 3 endeavors. In Vienna, in Serbia, and Romania, we did a clean sweep of all those 3 territories, which is grand. It was always nice to see that kind of thing. But it was one of those things that, what, should we actually restart? Because with this level of luck at the very first round of combat, I was debating if we should restart, but my opponent said, no, let's press onwards. And perhaps that was one of the first butterfly wings that started us down a specific pathway that led ultimately to a Central Powers victory. Regardless of that, our intentions were to hold the Italians on the Western Front and focus our attention eastwards towards Russia. And the Russians then pulled off a very clever move. It's kind of a classic one. In my opinion, it's one of those ones that should oftentimes be done, and put the bulk of their forces in Poland. There's usually 2 strategies that you see here, but this one here was particularly effective because it put the brakes on the Germans attacking Poland. It also meant that the Germans are faced with, after the Russians bulked up the entirety of their forces here, it meant that the Germans are faced with exposure to 2 territories, each worth 3 or going into this territory at poor odds to capture it. Now, another thing that the Russians did is they attacked Romania and contested that territory. So what they had is a nice border here of holding just 3 territories and having troops in this position to reinforce either flank. So that was quite nice of them. They did that quite successfully. Now, on our end of things, we had to make a disadvantageous attack into Poland. And that was a positional battle, and we took several hard hits into that fight. But nonetheless, we pressed onwards. Then the Russians, there's some back and forth as we struggled over Romania. Ultimately, I gained the upper hand, and then at that point, I employed a tactic where I always have outriggers, or I always have outrangers, or whatever you want to call it. I would have the bulk of my Austrian army, but one guy sitting parked adjacent in the Polish territory. And likewise, I'd attempt to have a German fellow parked there as well. That way I could move from contested territory and overwhelm my opponent one way or another. And by having the bulk of my army somewhere and just a single guy in another contested area adjacent, I could at will move my Austrian force, devastate the Austrian forces, Russian forces, and the Germans could follow up with like a 1-2 punch. And I employed that all across Russia quite successfully. And like I said, major army plus a core scouting army in adjacent territory, and this allowed me to take advantage of having 2 armies in one territory to double punch an enemy and knock them out of the fight. And so I did that in Russia and eventually managed to push them back bit by bit. At some point as Germany, I decided to go down a controversial path. Now, my theory when playing these games is I like to employ what I call a Carlsen strategy. Named after Magnus Carlsen, a chess player. And the idea there is do something unexpected and perhaps even counterintuitive and perhaps even disadvantageous to you, but it opens the battlefield up. So I built up a fleet, and that's kind of considered controversial as Germany. I was lucky on the first round of combat as Germany to take out basically the entirety of the British forces in Sea Zone 9 and off the coast of Canada, if memory serves. And so I was in a position where I could build up my navy a little bit. So I saved $5 on the first turn to see how that worked out for me. And I built up my fleet, and at that point, after I had a couple transports, I used it successfully in Russia to land troops in Karelia. And at that point, my hope was to open up the front lines, similar to a Gallipoli attack by the British, to open up a second front. And so by dropping troops off in Karelia and hoping to hold it, I would be able to move into the sea zone without being hit by mines each turn. And therefore, I wouldn't have this, in Russia, I wouldn't be faced with Poland, Ukraine, and Romania, and those 3 territories contested turn after turn after turn. If I went to Karelia, then I could open it up and force my opponent to protect Finland, protect Livonia, and even protect Moscow from that area as well. So that was the idea there. And the British perhaps seen that because they sent the bulk of their original army to Karelia as well, as opposed to sending them to the Western Front. So that worked out quite nicely. We put the pressure on the Russians by building I think it was 2 naval transports, and brought the British over on that side. Of course, the British were quite successful here and wiped me out completely, which meant that, yes, we attracted the British forces to Russia, which took them away from the Western Front, which allowed us to put more German emphasis into Russia than normally would be healthy for Germany. But on the flip side, it also meant that we were still quite weak on the Western Front, and we lost our second front in Karelia. So that was a situation there. But that gave us sufficient tactical advantage, where the Russians had to divert some resources not only to the north, but across Poland, Ukraine, and, if memory serves, Sevastopol. There's some struggle there as well. So it opened things up in a way that I could take advantage of it, capture Poland, and move into Ukraine and really start making inroads against Russia. So that's what worked out there. It also meant that since the British were absent from the Western Front, that I could spare less resources on this front, shifting the bulk of my forces westwards. But still, I left it very, very thin on this front. Very thin. Usually it would be a couple of my territories were generally always wide open to the enemy. And I must say I was a bit surprised France didn't dive into it, but I'm seeing it from my perspective. I saw all the terror that the French could ravage my countryside with, but in reality, perhaps they saw the amount of damage I could do in return against them. So it was a back and forth struggle here, and not any decisive battles really occurred on the Western Front. You'd see the Germans come to Belgium, move to Lorraine, move back to Picardy or Belgium, and kind of bounce around. We just moved our army in essentially this triangular: Belgium, Lorraine, Alsace, Belgium. At one point, we had moved our forces into Lorraine and were badly hit by the French, and so we had to scramble to move resources back and to reinforce our troops quite a bit as well. So at that point, things are quite grim for the German forces, and perhaps that would have been one opportunity for the French to really push hard, but they're also quite weakened by their attack against my German forces as well. But things are quite grim over here. In Venice, we had a different story where the Italians constantly would capture that territory, and we were faced with that same turn one problem where we had to take it back, otherwise the Italians could capture Trieste and Tyrolia. Of course, the Italians showed themselves quite tough as well when they landed in Albania, captured Serbia, and we had to scramble to hold onto those territories as well. So that was quite well done on the Italians' hand. But this was back and forth here. The devastating attack by the French really had me scared. I thought for sure at that point, after that attack, that we were definitely on the ropes. Then, let's see, after Russia collapsed, so I guess at that point, one of the advantages of a Carlson strategy is that you could do the unexpected and do something that's not the most optimal strategy, but it might open up options for you. And so at this point, I had 2 transports and 2, or whatever it was, 4 dreadnoughts. And then we had the American forces up here, and we had, because the American forces are here in order to protect what the British forces had in Sea Zone 6 all the way by Finland over there. And then we had the Americans, and then we had the British here, and they're just weak enough that we could tackle them, hit them. We lost the transport and damaged, I think, 2 of our dreadnoughts against their mines, but we managed to wipe out the British fleet plus, I think, 4 British transports and make a landing with 1 transport against unprotected London. And mathematically, it could have gone either way. It was a slight oversight by the British, but it wasn't an extraordinary oversight, because if the dice had worked out to their averages, I don't think I could have taken out London, but it was wide open, and so I managed to pull off a victory there. And that was really the culmination of our victory at this point, because at that point, I think the writing was in the cards, because we had the absent British income for 1 turn. They lost their income for 1 turn by giving it to the Germans, and the very next turn they were able to contest it, I believe, if memory serves, or even wipe me out completely by dropping off a couple transport loads of troops. So really, it wasn't much time at all. I think they flew back an aircraft and dropped off 4 units into London, capturing it from my 2 units defending there. They got it back, I believe, the next turn, if memory serves. But even though that's turns of income lost and handed over to Germany, a turn of their own income lost, because they can't produce that turn, and so at least $60, if not $90. I don't remember exactly. But at that point, yeah, things changed quite dramatically in favor of the Central Powers. And then, of course, you had the French were doing a bunch of stuff over here, making it very dramatic for our forces. And the Americans are pouring a constant force of troops across the Atlantic, or ships and infantry and dreadnoughts and that kind of thing coming into the fight. So it was quite the struggle. But at that point, things decidedly tipped from like a 40% Central Powers victory to a 70 or 80% Central Powers victory at that point. Now, in Germany. Well, let's take a look at the Eastern Frontier with the Ottomans. Now, our idea with the Ottomans was also to play a game of having outrigger armies or corps armies skirmishing in the adjacent area, and so we managed to, when the British income disappeared, to make a rapid push towards India and capture Afghanistan and Persia. And since they had no reinforcements, they had to retreat themselves towards India, giving us a slight advantage there. We also had a little back and forth in Egypt, but at the end of the day, we just didn't have enough resources that we could put into this fight. So the Ottomans did quite well, largely because the British were tied up in shoring up the Russians and assisting the French, and of course with the loss of the British income, they couldn't do as much against the Ottomans as they would have liked to. So that's a different situation there altogether. And also we were playing a bit of a game where we had pushed hard here, and so they'd reinforce this position and kind of drain troops out of Africa. And then we would turn, or at least we did that initially, we focused our attention on Egypt. They would feed troops into Egypt, and then we turned around and feed our attentions into India, and then they would draw troops out of Egypt, and lastly we flipped back to focusing on Egypt once again. So kind of flip-flopping back and forth a little bit. Now, of course, in Africa, eventually the Entente Cordiale captured our territories. There's not too much to be said here. We just moved our troops into Belgium, Congo, but really there's not too much strategy that we can employ in this area. They just decisively walked into all our territories and took them all out one by one. Great job by them. No complaints there. They did a good job of it, and I can't really say too much else beyond that because they just did a great job. The Americans were interesting. They're playing around back and forth. They were kind of the worrisome aspect of everything that they can do. So they had to go into Egypt so as to shore up the British there. Otherwise, the Ottomans would have been a little too strong for them. And so that let me breathe a sigh of relief because I really didn't want to see them on the Western Front where they could do some serious damage against us. In this case, they're employed primarily as a defensive force. And that's about it. There's a few things here and there. Now, one last thing I should talk about is the end game kind of stuff, where over here you saw that the Germans moved into Switzerland, and at that point the Germans had a unit present in Venice as well. So the French had to engage our forces with their 7 tanks. It was a decidedly large army. They had to either engage our forces in Switzerland or allow the Germans to hit Venice. And so they engaged our forces, and in the process they removed 7 of their armor, and that gave us the advantage on the Western Front as well. So we kind of forced a combat here by moving our forces into Switzerland. They had to choose between attacking our forces in Switzerland or letting us take out whatever the Italians had at Venice. Alternatively, of course, they could have had the Italians retreat to Tuscany, and then they could have made a move towards perhaps Lorraine and work their way up towards Germany, right? You could go onto Lorraine and put pressure on Alsace, or move northwards against this army here. Realistically, I think what they could have done is come to Lorraine, and then that would catch them in between my 2 armies, and so I could have just attacked them. But I think I was still too weak for that. So there's a few things that they could have done, but ultimately, I think they're in somewhat of a bad spot at that point, and the fact that they came into Switzerland and took off their 7 tanks, perhaps that could have been a mistake as well. Although I'm seeing it from my perspective, but I did let out a sigh of relief when they took out 7 tanks instead of 7 additional infantry. I think the tanks would have done them good service later on. I wanted to interject here and talk about the casualties of this Operation Schlieffen. We start off with a general observation about the Entente and the Central Powers, how many casualties they have. 315 for the Central Powers and 386 for the Entente Cordiale. So that's a general look at some of the casualties, but I want you to also notice the artillery. I never built much artillery, and anytime I started to risk artillery, I would pull back from combat. So you'll see generally my artillery stacks are less than even the British on the board as well. The only exception is the Italians and the Americans for the amount of artillery, but generally speaking, I kept my artillery losses quite low. 13 for the Austro-Hungarians. We have something like 20 here for the Russians. We have 11 here for the Germans. Over here we have, this looks to be, 28 over here. We have 12 over here, and for the Ottomans we have 5, the Italians have 3, and the Americans have 3. So generally light in the artillery department. We try to take our casualties more heavily on the infantry. For air forces, we were devastated time and time again by the Entente Air Force. 3 Austro-Hungarian air units lost. There's 2 Russians. There's 6 German air units lost. Only 3 French, only 3 British, and 3 Ottomans. So 1 Italian. But pound for pound, that's 3, that's 6, so that's 9, 10, 11, 12. 12 to the Ententes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. But, considering the fact that they're on multiple fronts, whereas I have the advantage of interior lines, I felt I was always shook up by how much times I would lose my Air Force time and time again, with very few lost on the opposing side. So it was quite something. For Navy, you see, of course, the entire Austrian, the entire Russian, the Germans. Is it true I guess we started with plenty of submarines, and we built a couple there as well. At least 1, if not 2. But we got 5 dreadnoughts sunk, 3 French, and the British lost 4 over here. The Americans here lost a total of 5. So that matches what the Germans had present over here, 5. And if we look on the board here too, we have another, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and the Americans have another 3. So there's plenty of fleet to go around. In fact, I had to start using Ottoman units as well. Tanks, I think there's 7 over here for French. There is 1 here for America, and nothing for anybody else. We've always tried to, even if it was almost detrimental, like even right here in Egypt, I was debating taking off some tanks, but we kept them on the board till the end. So I always avoided that. Of course, we lost the entirety of the Ottoman Navy and the Austro-Hungarian Navy as well. So there's that, but it proved to be a very interesting combat naval-wise. Otherwise, I like the look of these stacks. They're just stacks and stacks of infantry showing up for every nation. I've seen some images of other people in their infantry stacks, and not even counting the casualties stacks. There's just truly massive stacks of infantry on the board. Something to the tune of, something about the size of this, hanging out in Picardy, anticipating going into attacking the enemy. Like, just massive Cold War-esque buildup of troops all along the entire Western Front. So that's pretty interesting to see too. So I just wanted to share an image of what some of the casualties look like. It's really quite cool, and I think I'm going to try to do this for the Kings and Kaisers upcoming game as well. I think it'll be a lot of fun. I might even graph graph it up on an Excel spreadsheet just for the heck of it, right? I think it looks kind of neat to watch how the casualties look like, especially this here at the end. 315 to 386, and I've been perpetually ahead of the enemy. Now keep in mind too that some of these guys represent neutral nations, like this would be Belgium and Denmark, but also keep in mind that in the case of Afghanistan and Persia, I use the Ottomans too. So it's not entirely true that these are neutrals. That's all the British casualties. And of course, sometimes my math is wrong too. I try to stay as true as I possibly could to this, but some eagle-eyed scout will probably find, if you ever did an analytical detail of my videos, that I'm off by 2 or 3 British and 2 or 3, 4, 5, 6 Germans and the like, right? So who knows exactly, but I try to keep it as honest and upright and calculate as much as possible. Anyways, I thought that was kind of cool. Cheers. And that about concludes it. I have about another minute of information on the... I'm almost done. I have about another 30-40 seconds before I run out of space on my phone. I just want to say it was a fantastic game. I really enjoyed playing against these gentlemen. It was a lot of fun. I'm happy to play against them again in the future if I ever get around to it. Of course, I always like to play against new people too, so that's always fun. But I'm really happy how this turned out. And I think it was a fun game for all involved. We got to see some unique strategies that aren't often seen with the German fleet. We got to see the Ottomans doing some interesting things. We got to see London fall. That was kind of fun. People always say London fall. They never say London captured or something. We got to see some interesting and fun things. The only thing we didn't see is the Germans move into Norway and Sweden. But nonetheless, perhaps another time. Upcoming, I have a game of Kings and Kaisers, a YouTube war, which is based off of Axis and Allies 1914. So stick around if you're interested in watching that one. It'll be Operation Tannenberg. I am playing as the Germans, and I hope to add some extra flavor aspects into the game, specifically commanders. Thank you all for watching. Cheers. Everybody say goodbye. Goodbye. Say goodbye, Kimmy.